Krystal SURLES was born to Mark and Pamela. Mark and Pamela had divorced when Krystal was very young. Krystal was living in Kansas with her mother, Pamela, and her two younger sisters. Pamela and her daughters eventually decided to settle into their new home in the quiet Texas town of Del Rio. For Krystal, this change had another benefit besides simply living in a new house. She would be living very close to her best friend, Katie Harris. Mrs. Pamela was still busy moving a few belongings into the new house. She was both getting the house in order and keeping an eye on the little ones. During this time, Krystal had the opportunity to spend the night at the Harris family's house, and the two little girls were incredibly happy about it. On the night of December 30th, they chatted in the room. They laughed. They talked about everything and fell asleep without even noticing how time had passed. But the new day would begin for only one of the girls in that room. At 3:30 a.m., the Harris family's neighbor's door was knocked on. When the man opened the door, the scene he encountered was one he would never forget for the rest of his life. Standing in front of the door in her pajamas and barefoot was Krystal. She was holding the deep wound on her neck with one hand and bleeding. She couldn't speak because her windpipe had been severely damaged. The stunned neighbor immediately brought her inside and called 911. With trembling hands, Krystal took a piece of paper and wrote that the Harris family needed urgent help. Below that, she wrote that her neck had been cut and asked if she would survive. After the police arrived, Krystal was rushed to the hospital. Meanwhile, John Allen from the Texas Ranger Unit went to check on the Harris family's home. Krystal's mother, Pamela, was notified immediately. The woman couldn't believe what she was hearing. She dropped everything and set off for the hospital in Del Rio. By the time she reached the city, Krystal had already been taken into surgery, and the first details about the Harris family were beginning to come in. As Mrs. Pamela waited for her daughter to wake up, her heart was in her throat, because the painful truth she had to tell her was something no mother would ever want to face. When Krystal woke up from surgery, there was only one thing on her mind: what had happened to her best friend Katie? For her mother Pamela, telling her daughter the truth after the nightmare they'd been through was an unbearable ordeal. Unfortunately, Katie could not be saved. They found her lying motionless on the floor of her room in a large pool of blood. The autopsy revealed signs of sexual assault and 16 stab wounds. While all these horrific events were unfolding, the other members of the Harris family were asleep in their own rooms, and Krystal was the sole witness to what happened that night. But despite the physical pain she was enduring and the fear in her heart, she was ready to speak with the police. Because inside her, there was not only deep grief, but also an indescribable rage toward the person who had done this to them. When John Allen entered the hospital room and told her they would definitely find the culprit, Krystal recounted in detail what had happened that night. On the night of December 30th, there were 3 other people in the Harris family home besides Krystal and Katie. Katie's father was out of town. Her mother and 2 younger siblings were sleeping in their own rooms. Before going to bed, the girls couldn't decide who would sleep on the top bunk. In the end, Krystal went to the top bunk, and this decision, without her realizing it, saved her life. For the man who entered the house, it would have been much easier to reach Katie, who was sleeping downstairs. Around 3 a.m., Krystal woke up to a faint sound. When she opened her eyes, she saw a disheveled man with a scruffy beard holding Katie at the foot of the bed. The man covered Katie's mouth with one hand and held a knife out toward her with the other. He didn't notice that Krystal had woken up. The little girl froze in fear. She couldn't move. For a split second, Katie's gaze met Krystal's, and despite the man's hand pressing against her mouth, she managed to scream, "Call Mom!" But in response, the man plunged the knife directly into her neck. Katie collapsed to the floor, and the man continued to stab her over and over. Then he rushed out of the room. He likely headed to check if anyone else in the house had woken up. Krystal lay glued to the bed, holding her breath as she waited. Even though she desperately wanted to help her friend at that moment, she understood all too well that the slightest movement could cost her her life. When the man returned, he closed the door, turned on the light, and looked at Krystal. The girl retreated to the far end of the bed, but the man quickly approached and, in a single swift motion, lunged at her throat. Stunned by the blow, Krystal closed her eyes and lay completely still on her back. But this wasn't true unconsciousness. She was playing dead to save herself. She was losing blood as she heard the man's footsteps echoing through the house, but she didn't move. because he could return at any moment. When silence fell, Krystal crawled toward Katie. She gently touched her hand. She wanted to say everything would be okay, but no sound came out. There was no other option but to escape. She wasn't sure if anyone inside the house was still alive. The possibility that the killer was still inside terrified her. Taking a life-threatening risk, she quietly slipped outside and managed to reach the neighbors. They immediately called the police. It later turned out that Mrs. Harris and the young children were unharmed. They learned what had happened when the police arrived at the house. The killer thought he had left no one alive, but Krystal had not only survived but also remembered the man's face in detail. Based on her description, a forensic sketch artist drew a photo fit. Detectives screened criminals whose records matched the sketch. Among the photos sent to Krystal, she identified Tommy Lynn Sells without hesitation. On January 2nd, a police team went to Tommy Lynn Sells' residence and took him into custody. The suspect offered not the slightest resistance. He even went so far as to agree to accompany the police to the crime scene to demonstrate how the attack had taken place. The detectives were shocked as they listened to him calmly describe how he had committed the murder. But this attack was only the tip of the iceberg regarding Tommy's criminal history. When he was brought to the sheriff's office, he began detailing all the murders he had committed over the years and managed to evade punishment for. He spoke of approximately 70 separate attacks. The only thing that mattered to the Harris and SURLES families was that justice be served. Fortunately, there was more than enough evidence to convict Tommy. The killer's own confession and his description of the crime scene matched the autopsy findings, particularly the injuries Katie had sustained, exactly. He also led the detectives to a field near the Harris family's home where he had discarded the knife used in the murder. Other physical evidence included fibers from Tommy's clothing found on Katie and bloodstains from the victim found on the assailant. But above all, Krystal's testimony in court would determine the outcome of the case. It was an extremely difficult task for a child who had endured such a severe trauma. But Krystal was determined because she wanted to do this for Katie. The only thing that helped her recover from the intense ordeal was her devotion to her murdered friend. 9 months after this nightmare, Krystal had fully recovered. Her ability to speak returned completely, and on September 12, 2000, Tommy Lynn Sells' trial took place, and Krystal recounted the attack she had endured. The jury unanimously decided to sentence Tommy Lynn Sells to death in accordance with Texas law. For the Harris family, losing their child was an indescribable pain, but this court decision at least helped ease their suffering somewhat. The events of that night on December 31st had robbed Krystal of half her childhood. She went through a long and difficult process to recover from the deep psychological trauma she experienced. But over time, she pulled herself together. She clung to life once more. She continued her education. She made new friends, built a new life for herself, and most importantly, she never forgot the light of her close friend Katie. She still carries her in her heart. Krystal SURLES is a living example of human resilience. She is someone who shows that giving up is never an option, even in the darkest moments. Thanks to her courage and will to survive, the killer, who had managed to evade justice for 20 years, was finally caught. So how did this man manage to roam freely for years? And who was Tommy Lynn Sells really? Tommy was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California. His mother, Nina, was a woman raising 5 children on her own. There is no confirmed information about his father. However, some sources claim his father was a man named Joe Lovins, and that he died when Tommy was just 11 years old. In fact, Tommy's life began to take a turn for the worse from the moment he was born. He came into the world alongside his 2 sisters, Tammy and Jean. However, when they were 18 months old, both contracted severe meningitis. This was a serious infection of the membranes surrounding the brain and spinal cord. His 2 sisters did not survive the illness. Tommy, however, survived. After his illness, his mother, Nina, sent him to live with his aunt, Bonnie Walpole. But when Tommy turned 5, Nina learned that his aunt wanted to adopt him and took her son back. When Tommy was very young, he began regularly drinking alcohol by stealing from his grandfather's stash. A year later, an adult man named Willis Clark entered his life. It would later come to light that this man had committed crimes against children. Clark had assaulted Tommy. Worse still, his mother Nina knew about it but did nothing. This incident left a deep scar on Tommy. Years later, when he was arrested, he told the police during questioning that every time he committed a crime, the feelings he had experienced as a child resurfaced. Tommy started using drugs when he was very young. 3 years later, the first serious sign of his addiction emerged. One night, while his grandmother was asleep, he climbed into her bed naked. After this incident, Tommy was kicked out of the house and began living on the streets. He was rarely allowed to return home, until the day he attacked his own mother. Following this incident, Tommy was taken to a psychiatrist. However, he completely refused treatment. Soon after, his mother and siblings left him behind and suddenly moved out of town. Left completely on his own, the angry teenager Tommy was so enraged by what had happened that a few days later he found a gun, attacked a woman, and shot her. Fortunately, the woman survived. However, no clear information could be found regarding whether she reported the incident to the police or what exactly happened. By 1978, Tommy was 14 years old and had become a young man who wandered from city to city, making a living through petty theft. In 1979, while attempting to rob a house, he took the life of a man living there. This incident remained undiscovered for years. When he was arrested in 2000, he stated in his testimony that he had taken the man's life out of anger that day. In 1980, he got involved in a gang fight. During the ensuing brawl, he carried out a deadly attack and was seriously injured himself. After receiving initial treatment at the hospital, he went to Arkansas where his family lived and sought refuge with them. However, his erratic behavior continued there as well. One day, when he tried to approach his mother while she was taking a shower, he was kicked out of the house because of this behavior. After this incident, his alcohol and drug addiction rapidly worsened. In 1982, he was arrested for the first time after being found severely intoxicated on the street. The following years turned into the darkest and most brutal period of his life. In 2000, during a police interrogation, he described approximately 70 incidents he claimed to have committed at various times. He named names, described the victims, and tried to recall the dates and locations. However, despite all these confessions, detectives were only able to establish a concrete link between him and 22 of the cases. Because so many years had passed, the loss of physical evidence made it impossible to prosecute the remaining murders. Nevertheless, these confessions profoundly affected the fate of those cases and those families. Between 1982 and 1999, Tommy, who was homeless, traveled from city to city by hitchhiking and riding freight trains. This nomadic lifestyle, characterized by constant movement, allowed him to commit crimes and evade detection. Yet, during those years, he was officially arrested only a few times. In 1984, he received his first serious sentence. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison for stealing a car. While in prison, he underwent a psychiatric evaluation and a personality disorder was diagnosed. Despite this, he was released on parole a year later. At the time, law enforcement did not even know that the person they had released was not just a thief, but also the perpetrator of 3 murders. This was because those murders had not been solved by the time they were committed. After his release from prison, Tommy tried to make a living by working temporary jobs in different cities. He had 2 children with 2 different women and was married twice. On May 13, 1992, the only attack officially recorded at the time took place. That day, 19-year-old Fabienne Witherpun was driving down the road when she saw Tommy holding a cardboard sign that read, "I'll work for food." She felt sorry for him and wanted to help. She picked him up in her car and took him home. She told him to wait outside while she went inside to prepare food for him. However, while Fabienne was in the kitchen, Tommy sneaked into the house and grabbed a knife from the counter. He grabbed the young woman and dragged her into the bathroom, attempting to attack her. At that moment, Fabienne grabbed a ceramic duck figurine sitting on the edge of the bathtub and struck Tommy on the head with all her strength. She then managed to take the knife from his hand and wounded the attacker's kidney, liver, and 1 testicle. Tommy reacted with fury and struck her with a piano stool. However, the fight did not last long. Severely injured, Tommy was forced to flee. Due to the severity of his injuries, he had to go to the hospital immediately. Fabian, however, survived. He underwent surgery and filed a complaint regarding the incident. During the legal proceedings, Tommy pleaded guilty and reached a plea deal, resulting in a prison sentence of 2 to 10 years. While in prison, he underwent another psychiatric evaluation. This time, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Despite this, he was released on parole after 5 years. In his confessions from 2000, he explained that the murders he committed both before and after this prison term were entirely the result of impulsive urges. His victims ranged in age from newborn babies to 40-year-old adults. However, it emerged that the group he targeted most frequently was teenage girls. As I mentioned earlier, there were a few particularly horrific incidents that stood out among these confessions. The first of these took place on April 27, 1982, in St. Louis, Missouri. On that day, an unidentified assailant broke into the home of 35-year-old Joanne Tate. At the time, the woman's 7-year-old daughter, Melissa, was also at home with her. Joanne was killed. Melissa was sexually assaulted, but survived. During the investigation conducted at the time, based on the testimony of 7-year-old Melissa, who had survived the incident, it was concluded that the attacker was Rodney Lincoln. Lincoln was arrested and spent many years in prison. However, everything changed years later when footage of Tommy Selz's arrest was broadcast on television. Now an adult woman, Melissa realized upon seeing the face on the screen that her mother's real killer was not Rodney Lincoln, but Tommy. Subsequent investigations confirmed that Tommy had passed through the area where the Tate family lived on the day of the crime. As a result, Lincoln's conviction was overturned and he was released in 2018. Another shocking incident occurred on November 17, 1987, when a family was murdered in the state of Illinois. This case remained unsolved for a long time. However, years later, Tommy recounted all the details of the brutal crime he had committed. According to his account, while hitchhiking, 29-year-old Keith Dardeen picked him up, took him home, and invited him to dinner. While at the Darden family's home, Tommy first shot and killed Keith the father with 2 gunshots and then attacked the family's 3-year-old son with a baseball bat. One of the most heinous crimes he committed was against his 30-year-old pregnant wife, Elaine. During the attack, the poor woman went into labor. The baby born into the world also became Tommy's victim. Despite all these confessions, the police were unable to find any physical evidence to charge the attacker due to the many years that had passed. However, another confession by Tommy completely changed the fate of someone else. On October 13, 1997, 10-year-old Joel Kirkpatrick was stabbed to death in his own room at night. His mother, Julie Rhea Harper, woke up to the sounds and rushed to her son's room, where she came face to face with a masked assailant. The woman managed to fight off the man. However, the assailant fled the house in a panic. This escape, combined with the fact that a kitchen knife was used in the murder, instantly turned Julie from a witness into a suspect. As a result of the investigation, Julie was charged with killing her own son and sent to prison. 2 years later, everything changed. Tommy confessed to committing the murder and provided details known only to the police, proving that Julie was innocent. As a result, she was acquitted and released. Of all the confessions Tommy made, only one case brought him back to court. It was the case of 9-year-old Mary Beat Rice Perez, who went missing in San Antonio on April 19, 1999. The little girl's lifeless body was found 10 days later in a creek bed. However, the killer remained unidentified for a long time. After Tommy was arrested in 2000, he confessed to abducting Mary, assaulting her, and strangling her to death with her t-shirt. An additional trial was held in 2003, and he was sentenced to life in prison in addition to the death penalty. Although the case concluded with his confession, the physical evidence on which the court based its decision was not disclosed to the public. While awaiting the death penalty, Tommy underwent a new and comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. Experts identified a series of serious mental disorders in him: bipolar disorder, depressive disorder, opioid, amphetamine, marijuana, and alcohol addiction, as well as a personality structure exhibiting antisocial and schizoid traits, were reported. Neurocriminologist Dr. Adrian Rain's assessments regarding the brain structure of individuals with such psychiatric disorders had been shared with the public. Dr. Rain was an expert who had been studying the brains of individuals scientifically proven to be psychopaths for many years. His research indicated that the most prominent difference in these individuals was a structural impairment in the brain's emotional center. On January 3, 2014, Tommy Lynn Selz's execution was carried out at the state prison in Huntsville, Texas. The SURLES, Harris, and Perez families were present during the execution. Tommy declined to exercise his right to a final statement. After the lethal injection was administered, he took a few deep breaths. He closed his eyes and became completely motionless within less than a minute. It was announced that he died at 6:27 p.m. local time.